He thought he was just meeting a sponsor. A neat meeting, a hot cup of coffee, 1 hour spent talking about numbers, plans, and a name that had been engraved on a gravestone 2 years ago. Nothing more, nothing less. 4 days before Christmas, Ethan Miller, 41, parked his old pickup truck in front of Harbor Street Café, a small place tucked along a lakeside road in suburban Wisconsin. The air was cold. There was no snow, but the damp chill seeped deep into the skin, the kind of cold that makes you want to finish what you came for and get home as quickly as possible. Ethan turned off the engine and sat still in the truck for a few more seconds. He had been doing that for a long time, sitting still before stepping into a place where he might have to talk. Not because he feared other people, but because he feared himself. Feared careless questions, feared looks of pity, feared the name Sarah, his wife, being spoken in a way that made his chest tighten. Ethan's life over the past 2 years had been built on routine, and routine was the only thing keeping him upright. He took a deep breath, opened the door, and walked inside. The small wind chime on the door rang softly, a sound so faint most people would have ignored it. But to Ethan, it felt like a warning. There was something about this evening that would not be what he expected. The cafe was warm, bathed in gentle yellow light, the smell of roasted coffee mixed with cinnamon and baked goods. A few couples spoke quietly. An older woman sat by the window reading a book. No one paid him any attention. Except one person. In the corner of the cafe, a woman sat alone, wearing light blue hospital scrubs. Both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, her eyes tired, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from a long day, but from years of unspoken wait. Ethan glanced at his watch. 6:55. He was 5 minutes early, as always. The woman looked up. Their eyes met for a very brief moment, then she stood. "Ethan?" she asked, her voice uncertain but her eyes full of recognition. He nodded and stepped closer. "I'm Claire." He hadn't had time to say anything before she continued. Just 5 words. 5 words so light they should not have been able to hurt anyone, yet strong enough to bring one man's world to a halt. "Sarah wanted me to find you." Ethan felt as if something had fallen out of his chest. Not a blow, but a sudden emptiness. And in that moment he understood one thing. This evening had never been just a coffee meeting. 2 years. 730 days had passed since the morning Ethan Miller signed the final document at the hospital, the paper that confirmed a truth he had never been ready to accept. From that day on, his life was no longer measured by emotion, but by routine. The alarm rang at 5:15 a.m., steady and relentless, like an emotionless reminder. Ethan sat up the moment it sounded, no hesitation, no allowing himself time to think. Thinking meant feeling, and living, at least now, meant not being allowed to stop. He made breakfast for Caleb, his 8-year-old son, fried eggs, toast, and a glass of milk. Everything is prepared in the correct order at the correct time. Caleb sat at the table, head lowered, chewing slowly. Father and son rarely spoke in the mornings, not because they didn't love each other, but because they both knew there were empty spaces that, if touched, would shatter. Ethan drove his son to school. He always waited until Caleb walked through the gate, turned back, and waved before pulling away. It was one of the few moments in the day that made him feel like he was doing something right. Then came work. One construction site after another. Old kitchens torn out, walls knocked down, new tiles were laid in place. Ethan liked things that could be fixed, things that were broken, but with enough patience, enough strength, could still be rebuilt from the ground up. Emotions were not like that. The work made his hands ache and his back sore, but his mind stayed empty, and that was precisely what he needed. When the hammer came down, when the drill screamed through concrete, memories fell silent. Sarah did not appear in those moments, and if she didn't appear, then he could keep going. Christmas used to be Ethan's favorite time of the year. He and Sarah used to argue over whether to hang the porch lights. She always played the music too loudly. He always complained, then laughed. But after Sarah died, Christmas became a season to endure. No tree, no decorations, no music. Caleb had asked, the first year. Ethan said, "Dad's just too busy this year." The second year, the boy didn't ask again, and that hurt Ethan more than any question ever could. In the evenings after Caleb had fallen asleep, Ethan sat alone in the darkened living room. The television was on, but he couldn't remember what he was watching. He didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't break down. He simply existed. And he told himself that was enough. Until those 5 words were spoken in the cafe, and the wall of routine he had built over 2 years began to crack. Ethan froze in place. Those 5 words did not land like an explanation. They landed like a sentence that had been postponed for 2 years and was now finally being read aloud. "Sarah wanted me to find you." He stared at the woman in front of him longer than necessary, as if trying to determine whether he had heard her wrong. The hospital scrubs. There were faint dark circles under her eyes. The slight inward curve of her shoulders, a posture familiar to those who have grown used to holding themselves together in the presence of other people's pain. "I'm sorry. What did you say?" Ethan asked again, even though he knew perfectly well that he had heard her clearly. The woman took a deep breath, as if she herself wasn't sure she was ready for this moment. "My name is Claire Thompson," she said slowly. "I used to work at a hospice center. I was the nurse who cared for Sarah during her final weeks." The world around Ethan seemed to slow down. The sound of a spoon touching a cup at the nearby table. The door opened, then closed behind him. Everything suddenly felt distant, blurred. "That's impossible," he said quietly, though his voice came out hoarse. "This meeting. Rachel told me you were a sponsor?" Claire finished, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. "I was told that you wanted to meet someone who had been with Sarah during her final days, that you had questions, that you needed an explanation." 2 pieces of truth collided, misaligned, and Ethan understood. Not a business meeting, not a scholarship fund, not a coincidence. This had been arranged. The feeling of betrayal surged so quickly that he couldn't control it. His heart pounded, his ears rang. Everything he had spent 2 years avoiding, memories, questions, unanswered pain, was now being forced to the surface in the middle of a cafe full of strangers. He stood up abruptly. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, the sharp sound causing a few people to turn and look. "No," Ethan said, his voice higher than usual. "No, I didn't agree to this. Rachel had no right." "Ethan, please." Claire stood up instinctively, raising her hand as if to stop him, then suddenly hesitated. "I'm sorry. I truly didn't know she hadn't been clear with you. If I had known, I never would have—" "It's not your fault," Ethan cut in, hurriedly shrugging his coat over his shoulders. "But I can't do this. Not here. Not like this." He turned toward the door, each step heavy, as if the floor had tilted beneath him. He needed air. He needed space. He needed to escape this moment before something inside him completely shattered. Just as his hand touched the door handle, Claire's voice came from behind him. Not loud, not pleading, just a single sentence, spoken with all the gravity of someone who had held a secret for far too long. "Ethan, before Sarah passed away, she made me promise one thing." He stopped. He did not turn around, but his entire body went rigid. And in that moment, Ethan had no idea that the door he was about to open to run away was the very door that would lead him back to his life. Ethan stood still in front of the cafe door. His hand remained on the cold metal handle, but he didn't open it. Not out of curiosity, but out of fear. Fear that if he turned back, if he heard even one more sentence, the thing he had spent 2 years burying would no longer stay buried. He had done everything to avoid this moment, avoid long conversations, avoid questions that begin with "back then," avoid even naming the pain itself. And now, that pain was standing directly behind him, wearing the face of a stranger with a voice calm enough to be terrifying. "Ethan," Claire called again, slower this time, as if afraid that raising her voice even slightly might make him disappear. "I know you don't want to hear this, but if I don't say it now, I'll never have another chance to say it." He closed his eyes. There are moments in life when you know clearly that you are standing at a crossroads. And even if you don't turn around, even if you don't look, you can still feel it. Ethan turned back, not because he was ready, but because he was too exhausted to keep running. "What else do you want to say?" he asked, his voice low and rigid as if he were building one final wall. Claire didn't step closer. She simply stood where she was, her hands clasped together, her gaze steady, neither evasive nor forceful. "Sarah was afraid of one thing," she said. "Not death, but that you would stop after she was gone." The words struck Ethan directly, without noise, without drama, but with ruthless precision. He gave a faint, bitter smile. "She worried too much." Claire shook her head almost imperceptibly. "No. She understood you better than anyone." The cafe seemed to recede into the background. Sounds dulled as if the entire space were honoring a private moment to which no one else had been invited. "Sarah said you would do everything right," Claire continued. "You would take care of your son, you would work hard, you would not fall apart. But you would also not live." Ethan felt his throat go dry. This was no longer anger. No longer the feeling of being deceived. This was exposure. "I don't need anyone telling me how to live," he replied, but his voice no longer carried the certainty it had moments before. "I lost my wife. I have the right, you have the right to hurt," Claire interrupted, her voice trembling for the first time. "But Sarah didn't want that pain to become the place you stay forever." She took a deep breath as if crossing an invisible line herself. "She made me promise," Claire said slowly, "that if, by the second Christmas, you were still only existing, I had to find you, no matter how difficult it was." Ethan took a step back, not because he was afraid of Claire, but because he was afraid of the truth that had just been spoken. He had thought he was controlling his pain, but now he realized pain does not need to be controlled. It only needs to be heard. And for the first time in 2 years, Ethan understood something that nearly took his breath away. Maybe he wasn't running because this meeting had been arranged, but because deep down he knew if he stayed, he would have to face himself. Claire didn't speak right away. She stood there in the middle of a cafe that was gradually growing noisy again, yet her face seemed completely detached from the space, as if her mind were replaying a different room, a different moment. "She told me that on a very quiet evening," Claire began, her voice lowering. "There were no loud machines, no one else in the room, just Sarah, and the awareness that her time was running out." Ethan didn't sit down. He remained standing, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets as if that were the only way to keep himself from trembling. He didn't look at Claire, but every word she spoke found its way straight into his chest. Sarah knew she was leaving, Claire continued. But what worried her most wasn't death. It was the days that would come after. For you. Ethan closed his eyes. Sarah's image appeared with painful clarity. Not Sarah in a hospital bed, but Sarah was in their small kitchen, hair tied up, smiling as he spilled coffee. Sarah from ordinary days, the version he had tried not to remember because remembering hurt too much. She said you would be strong, Claire said. You wouldn't let anyone worry. You would do everything right. But because of that, she was afraid you would forget how to allow yourself to be weak. Claire reached into her bag and took out an envelope. She didn't hand it over right away. She simply held it, as if asking permission from herself. The night before Sarah passed away, she said, she gave me this. She made me promise 2 things. First, not to open it. Second, to give it to you only during the Christmas week of the 2nd year. Ethan opened his eyes. He turned to look at her for the first time since the conversation began. Why 2 years? He asked, his voice rough. Claire met his gaze. Because Sarah said, that was enough time for you not to collapse, but long enough for you to become stuck. The words nearly knocked Ethan off balance. 2 years. Not random, not a guess, but the painful understanding of a wife who knew him too well. She said, Claire went on, her voice trembling slightly, that if by then you were still living only out of responsibility, someone would need to remind you that loving her did not mean stopping. Ethan reached out his hand, then pulled it back. He wasn't ready to touch that envelope, not ready to face that familiar handwriting. She told me to tell you, Claire said softly, almost like a confession, that some words cannot be written on paper. They have to be spoken at the right time, in the right place, when you have nowhere left to hide. Ethan understood. This meeting, this cafe, this moment, it wasn't a trap. It was a promise being activated. And for the first time in 2 years, Ethan realized a truth that made his heart ache. Sarah hadn't only prepared for her own death. She had prepared for the life he still had ahead of him. Claire placed the envelope on the table, but Ethan still didn't touch it, as if simply reaching out would cause the entire hardened shell he had built over 2 years to shatter. And this time, he wouldn't be able to gather the pieces the way he did with broken bricks at a construction site. There's a part, Claire said slowly, that Sarah wouldn't let me write down. She said these words had to be spoken directly, so you could hear them with your own ears, so you could see that someone else was carrying them to you. Ethan swallowed hard. His throat burned, dry as if he had swallowed sand. What did she say? He asked, his voice so small it nearly dissolved into the air. Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment as if placing herself back in that hospice room years ago. When she opened them again, her voice trembled slightly, but every word was clear. Sarah said, "Tell Ethan that I didn't disappear." Ethan shook his head faintly, an unconscious reflex, but Claire didn't stop. "I'm in every morning you wake Caleb, in every house you build with those work-worn hands, every time you choose to keep going even when you're exhausted." Ethan's breathing began to break. He lowered his head, both hands gripping the edge of the wooden table. His knuckles turned white. "Tell him that loving me doesn't mean he has to stop his life." Claire continued, her voice breaking at the end of the sentence.
It means he has to live it more fully, because I can't do that anymore.
That was when Ethan couldn't hold it in any longer. His shoulders shook. A sob tore out of his chest, raw, unrestrained, unaware of the eyes around him. He cried right there at the cafe table, among strangers, on an evening he had thought would be nothing more than get it done and go home. Claire reached across the table and gently placed her hand over his, not to pull him back, not to soothe him with words, just a profoundly human touch. She also said, Claire whispered, that 2 years is enough time to hurt, but not enough to turn grief into an entire lifetime. Ethan looked up. His eyes were red, his vision blurred. How did she know? He asked, almost desperately. How did she know I'd still be stuck like this? Claire looked at him with the eyes of someone who had witnessed too many goodbyes. Because she knew you, she said. She knew you would do everything for your son, for your work, for everyone else, except yourself. The cafe was strangely quiet now. No one spoke, no one hurried them, as if everyone understood. Some moments should not be interrupted. Ethan raised his hands to cover his face, and in that moment he realized something that made his heart ache until it nearly stopped. Sarah hadn't left these words to anchor him to the past. She had left them to push him back toward life. And for the first time in 2 years, Ethan no longer felt like he was falling. He was being reached. They sat in silence for a few seconds. No one was in a hurry. No one knew what else needed to be said. Ethan kept his head lowered, both hands resting on the table as if he were holding the world in place, keeping it from tilting again. The tears had stopped, but a dull ache lingered in his chest, not from grief rising, but from something more profound, slower, shifting. Claire cleared her throat softly. There's one more thing, she said cautiously. I wasn't planning to bring it up if you weren't ready, but Sarah was very firm about this. Ethan looked up. His eyes were tired, red-rimmed, but no longer avoiding. What is it? He asked. Claire took her phone out of her bag. The movement was slow, careful, as if the device held something more fragile than glass. Sarah recorded a video, she said, 3 days before she passed away. She made me promise that I would only show it to you after I'd said everything I just told you. Ethan felt his heart pound so hard his ears rang. A video? He repeated, as if confirming something impossible. Claire nodded. If you don't want to watch it now, I understand. No one is forcing you. No, Ethan interrupted, his voice rough but steady. I want to. I need to see her. Claire unlocked the screen and turned the phone toward him. And then Sarah appeared. Not the frail Sarah from Ethan's last memories, but Sarah with her familiar smile, the smile that used to make him feel that everything would be okay. Hi, Ethan, Sarah said in the video, her voice weak but warm. If you're watching this, then I guess it's been 2 years. Ethan drew in a sharp breath, as if all the air had been pulled from his lungs. Sarah continued, her gaze gentle to the point of pain. I'm guessing you're still working too much. Still eating whatever's easiest. Still thinking that if you stay busy long enough, the pain will get tired and leave. Ethan let out a soft laugh through his tears. She still knew him. She always had. But listen, Sarah said, her voice slowing.
I didn't marry you so that when I left, you would disappear too. I married you because you know how to build houses, a family, and even ordinary days. Sarah's eyes began to fill with tears on the screen. Caleb needs to see you smile, not just exist. And you deserve that too. Loving me doesn't mean you have to stop here. Sarah took a deep breath. If someone is sitting next to you right now, someone patient enough to carry these words to you, please be kind to her. I chose the right person. The video ended with a blown kiss. The screen went dark. Ethan said nothing. He couldn't. The entire cafe sank into a strange stillness. No one pretended not to notice. No one looked away. A server quietly placed a fresh box of tissues on the table and walked off. Ethan wiped his face and slowed his breathing. In that moment, he understood something he had not allowed himself to consider for 2 years. Sarah hadn't left him in pain. She had left only after preparing the path for him to keep walking. And for the first time since the day she died, Ethan no longer felt like he was betraying her by thinking about living on. He only felt permitted. 3 days passed after the evening at the cafe. 3 days in which Ethan carried the envelope in his coat pocket, placed it on his desk, then slid it back into a drawer. He still hadn't opened it. Not because he didn't believe, but because he was afraid. Afraid that once he finished reading it, he would no longer have a reason to keep hiding. On the morning of December 23rd, Ethan woke earlier than usual. Outside, pale winter light filtered through the window. The house was so quiet he could clearly hear the heater clicking on and off in its steady rhythm. Caleb walked into his room wearing pajamas, slightly too big for his thin frame. The boy climbed onto the bed and sat beside him, his curious gaze settling on the envelope resting on the nightstand. "Dad?" Caleb asked softly, as if afraid of breaking the stillness of the morning. "What's that?" Ethan followed his son's eyes. "A letter from Mom," he replied. Just 3 words, but his throat tightened instantly. Caleb was silent for a moment. Then he asked again, very slowly, "Are you going to read it?" "When I'm ready," Ethan said. He thought the answer was safe enough. Caleb nodded, then unexpectedly leaned his head against Ethan's shoulder. A tiny, very familiar gesture. But the voice that followed was different, lower, older than an 8-year-old's should be. "I miss Mom," Caleb said. "But I also miss the old Dad." Ethan froze. "I'm still here," he replied automatically. Caleb shook his head very slightly. "You're here," the boy said, "but you're not really here anymore." The words weren't loud. There was no blame, no crying, but they landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples spread outward, impossible to stop. "You don't smile anymore," Caleb continued, looking down at his hands. "You don't decorate for Christmas. Mom loved Christmas, and now our house doesn't have a tree. I know you're sad, but I'm sad too." Ethan felt his heart tighten painfully. He had thought that doing his duty was enough. Simply being present every day meant he was fulfilling his role as a father. But he had forgotten something crucial. Children don't learn from what adults say. They learn from how adults live. Ethan pulled Caleb into his arms and held him tightly. For the first time in a long while, he didn't try to hold back his tears in front of his son. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't know. I didn't realize I was letting you see me like that." Caleb wrapped his arms around Ethan's back and hugged him in return. "It's okay," the boy said. "I just want you to be happy again.
In that moment, Ethan understood a simple but painful truth. He wasn't only teaching his son how to live after loss, he was teaching him how long the loss was supposed to last. And for the first time since Sarah died, Ethan made a decision not just to exist, but to begin living again. Ethan didn't say anything more to Caleb that night. He simply held his son for a long time, longer than usual, as if trying to carve that warmth into his bones. When Caleb had fallen sound asleep, Ethan sat alone in the living room, the house bathed in its familiar pale yellow light, the same light that had been there for 2 years, yet had never truly made the house feel warm. The envelope was still lying on the table, but this time, Ethan didn't look at it with fear. He picked up his phone. His finger hovered for a few seconds over Claire's name, a name that hadn't belonged in his life 3 days ago, yet now appeared like a thin thread connecting him to something waiting ahead. He pressed call. "Claire," Ethan said the moment she answered, his voice unsteady with urgency. "I know it's late. I know this is strange, but I need help." On the other end of the line, Claire was silent for a very brief beat. She didn't ask why. She didn't ask for what. "What do you need help with?" she asked. Ethan swallowed hard. "I need to decorate for Christmas for Caleb. I can't do it alone. All of Sarah's things are still in storage. I don't dare open them." "Send me the address," Claire said. "I'll come right away." 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Claire stood there in a simple sweater and jeans, looking less like the composed woman from the café and more like a very real person, tired, genuine, and ready to roll up her sleeves. Caleb opened the door. "Who are you?" the boy asked, his guarded look exactly like that of a child. Claire bent down to his eye level. "I'm Claire," she smiled. "I'm here to help decorate for Christmas, if you'll let me." Caleb turned to Ethan, his eyes lighting up. "Really, Dad?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah. This year, we're decorating." That moment, just one sentence, felt as if something inside the house had been switched back on after 2 years of darkness. They drove together to the storage unit. When Ethan opened the door, stacks of cardboard boxes came into view, each marked with Sarah's familiar handwriting. "Christmas decorations. Handle with care. Lots of memories." Ethan's hands began to tremble. Claire placed her hand on his arm, her touch gentle yet steady. "We'll do one box at a time. If it gets too hard, we stop." Ethan nodded. Not a grand promise, just a very human agreement. 3 hours later, Ethan's house had undergone a change. Lights were hung along the porch, a wreath was placed on the door. Caleb directed everything with enthusiastic authority. "That goes over there. Mom always put the star on last." Christmas music filled the house, the same old playlist Sarah used to play every year. And for the first time in 2 winters, the house no longer felt like a museum of pain. It became a home again. Ethan watched Caleb laugh and realized healing doesn't begin with forgetting. It begins with the courage to touch the things that once hurt. And that night, as Caleb fell asleep on the sofa amid empty decoration boxes, Ethan understood. He had taken a tiny step, but it was a step that changed the direction of his entire life. That night, after the house had grown quiet again, Ethan sat alone beside the newly set-up Christmas tree. The blinking lights reflected off the old glass ornaments, pieces Sarah had once wrapped so carefully, each labeled with her familiar handwriting. The envelope rested in his hands. This time, he didn't hesitate. Ethan opened the letter. There were no flowery words, no tragedy, only a familiar voice, gentle, as if Sarah were sitting right beside him. She wrote that love is not something that gets used up when it is given away. It is something that expands. That loving another person does not erase old memories, but proves those memories are strong enough to nurture more life. That Caleb needs a father who truly lives, not a monument to grief. And then Ethan understood something he had not allowed himself to consider for 2 years. Sarah did not want him to stay with the pain. She wanted him to move forward with love. The months that followed were not a miracle. Ethan did not heal overnight. There were days he was still tired. Some memories still made his chest ache. But he began to smile more. Caleb began to discuss school more, and the house, at last, had voices in it again. Ethan and Claire did not rush anything. They began with short conversations, pressure-free coffee meetings, and simple family dinners. No one tried to replace anyone. No one was asked to forget. Just two people who had been hurt, learning how to stay. 1 year later, Ethan returned to the same café where everything had begun. He knelt, not for a fairy tale ending, but for a beginning brave enough to choose. When Claire nodded through tears, Ethan knew. This love did not betray the past. It honored it. In their new home, Sarah's photos still sat on the mantel, beside newer pictures. None were hidden, none were replaced. Because life does not ask us to erase what we once loved. Life asks only one thing: whether we dare to keep living. Loving again does not erase the one we lost. It proves that love is big enough to continue. The people we lose do not want us to survive merely. They want us to live fully. If this story touched you, if you are carrying pain and don't yet know when or how to move forward, remember this: moving ahead is not betrayal. It is courage. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that happiness is still allowed after loss. Don't forget to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Deep Life Tales, where everyday stories remind us how to live deeper, more accurate, and kinder each day. Thank you for being here. And remember, the human heart can break, but it can also grow.